Keith. I'm an instructor and lecturer at the Greenmount Campus, CAFRE in Northern Ireland, and I'm currently working from home because of COVID-19, as many of us are, but still managing to do a bit of gardening. So I wanted to show you in the next maybe 3 or 4 minutes a wee technique that I've been using. Spring has sprung, and I've been doing some air layering, so I wanted to show you that in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So this is an example of an air layer just here. It's a technique that can be applied to any tree, shrub, climber, any woody species. I've done this on this azara, small tree, shrub. Fantastic. And the reason I want to do that because these are rare and they're expensive. So if I can get lots of free ones, job's a good one. But the beauty of the technique is that you don't need a greenhouse, you don't need a propagating bench. The technique is actually applied on the plant itself. So before I show you the technique, let me just go one step back from what's an air layer to what's a layer. So many traditional types of propagation are just based on observation and then adapting a natural process. So for example, here's a bit of ivy. It travels along the ground and just puts down roots where it touches the ground, and that's how it travels. And if I broke that away, that would be an independent plant from the mother plant, because it can survive on its own because it has a root system. Now, shrubs can do exactly the same thing. You have a low branch which is maybe moving along the ground with the wind, and it's basically abrasing the ground, creating a wound, and eventually that wound, if it's covered up with a few leaves and whatever, after a while it'll set down roots. So let me show you an example of that there. So here's a skimia shrub in my garden, and last spring I took a low branch and I wounded it at a leaf node, just basically cutting into it with a sharp knife just about 1/3 of the way along the stem, and not to weaken it in any way, just to wound it. And then I pegged it into the ground. I basically dug a little hole, pegged it into the ground with the growing tip emerging from the hole, so just the wounded part being pegged into the ground, and then covered that up with a bit of soil. And as you can see, here we are, following spring, all that roots formed there. And if I severed that from the mother plant and potted it up or put it into the ground, then that can grow independently away. So with air layering, what we're simply doing is exactly the same technique as layering. The only difference being we're simply bringing the ground up to a stem, because these stems are too high to reach the ground. That's the only difference. Let me just show you materials that you're going to need to do this. So the equipment and materials you're going to require are fairly rudimentary. You're going to need a little bit of damp moss, and there's plenty of that around in lawns and whatever. About the size of an egg, about that much. Now this is not absolutely required, but it helps speed things along. There's a thing that you can get in garden centres called hormone rooting powder, and it just basically speeds up the process. It's not necessary, it just speeds things up. But listen, nature doesn't have this stuff, so it's not really important. And you'll need a little square of black plastic, about 15 centimetres square. That's just from the bin bag. And I need a little bit of clear plastic, same kind of dimensions, 15 centimetres or so. That's just taken from one of those fruit and veg bags found in the supermarket. And finally, from a materials point of view, you're going to need about 4 or 5 of the wee twist sticks that you tie things up and seal a bag with, one of those. 4 or 5 of those. And you're also going to need a sharp knife, and possibly a pair of secateurs. And that's it. I mean, this technique causes very little time or money. That's the beauty of it. It's brilliant. So let's go and show you how to use it. So okay, so I'm going to do an air layer on this camellia. So what I'm looking for is a reasonably horizontal branch if it's apparent, and I'm also looking for the newest growth. So I'm looking at this one here. I can see the new growth is here, and this was last year's growth and was the previous year's growth. So the best rooting potential is near the tip of the branch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove some leaves near the end of this stem, and that will give me a little bit of sort of working room, so to speak. So there we have it. So that is this year's growth and last year's growth, and I'm going to apply an air layer to that. Okay, so I've made a little bit of space here along the stem for me to work on. I'm going to wound the plant just by cutting into the wood about a quarter of the way through, and just along where a leaf joint was between the last year's growth and this year's growth, for about a centimetre or so. I've created that wee wound. Next thing to do is I have some moss with hormone rooting powder on that, and I'm literally just going to clamp it on from the top onto that there. And that should stay just like so. And so the reason I'm applying a moss into this here is the moss provides some insulation, just like the roots are underneath the ground where it's nice and toasty. So the moss provides insulation. It's also got, it's offering something for the roots to bind onto, and when we go to check this later on, we can see if the roots are binding into that. And it's freely available and very light, so it doesn't weigh the stem down in any way. So okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bind that all together, that moss, with some clear plastic. This is the fiddly bit. And just tie it in with a couple of twist sticks. Nice and firmly. So that's not going to move. And the reason we're using clear plastic, it enables us to, whenever we come to check on whether there's rooting or not, we can check if the roots have been formed without actually disturbing the moss itself and the roots themselves. So you can see through it. It also adds another layer of protection, insulation during the winter months. There we are. So the final stage of your air layer is to put the black plastic over that, over the clear plastic. And the reason why we're using black plastic is it excludes light. Most plants like to have their roots underneath the ground where there's no light, and this is the same. So another reason is it's another form of insulation, which is good, particularly in our climate. The Spanish do this, but they do it with tinfoil. It deflects the heat. But with black plastic, it attracts the light and heat, and so is better for our climate. Another wee tip is to, wherever that's joining, that the join is actually underneath the stem, so that prevents the ingress of moisture, which is one of the main reasons for air layers failing. And another wee tip is to, whenever you're using these wee twist sticks, is to make them really tight to prevent the ingress of moisture. And that should be nice and tight, it's well insulated. And there you have it. There's your air layer. Good luck. Okay, one final thought. So you've done your air layer. It's springtime now. The reason this isn't done commercially is it's quite slow. It is done in the heritage sector, where they have very unusual species, and the real benefit is that you're not taking a cutting. The cutting is developing on the mother plant, and it's quite slow. But it's a belt and braces approach. So this will take, depending on the species, between a year, possibly 2. So this time next year, or maybe next summer, I'll come along, check this, just take away the black plastic, see if I can see the roots, if there is. Then I can just sever that from the mother plant and pot it up or plant it. It may well not have formed, depending on the species. Some species are quite slow. It may be the following summer. And there's no harm in leaving it on for 2 summers. It's slow, but if you do lots of them on different plants, they'll all be rooting in different times. Patience.